She walked into the dark, knowing the stone could not be moved. That is the detail that breaks you open if you let it. Not the earthquake, not the angel, not the empty tomb. Those come later. What came first was a woman stepping out of a doorway into a cold April night, carrying 37 pounds of burial spices she had purchased the moment the Sabbath ended, knowing full well that a 2-ton limestone disc sealed the entrance to the only place in the world she wanted to be, and that she had no way to open it. She went anyway. She walked nearly 3 kilometers in darkness, so complete she could barely see the road beneath her feet, toward a tomb she could not enter, to anoint a body she could not reach. Because love does not calculate whether the stone can be moved. Love walks. The year was 33 AD. The date was a Sunday, the first day of the Jewish week, the 17th of the month of Nisan. In Jerusalem's upper city, and in the village of Bethany just beyond the Mount of Olives, the last watch of the Roman night patrol was winding down. The Quarter Vigilia ran from 3 in the morning until 6, and the soldiers assigned to the city's streets moved in pairs through alleys still holding the cold of a desert night. The temperature hovered near 8 degrees. The limestone paving stones radiated the chill upward through the thin soles of leather sandals, and anyone moving through the streets at that hour would have felt the cold settle into their bones like a second kind of grief. Mary Magdalene felt both. She had watched him die. She had stood at the foot of a Roman cross on a Friday afternoon, not at a safe distance, not from a rooftop, but close enough to hear the labored rhythm of his breathing change. And she had stayed. Others had fled. The men who had promised to die with him were scattered across the city, barricaded behind locked doors, waiting for the knock that would mean their own arrest. But Mary stayed, and now, less than 40 hours later, she was walking through pre-dawn darkness toward his tomb because the Sabbath had kept her away for an entire day, and she could not bear one more hour of separation from the body of the man who had given her back her life. To understand the weight of what she carried, not the spices, but the devotion, you have to understand who she had been before Jesus found her. Luke's gospel identifies her simply, almost clinically, Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had been cast out. 7. In Jewish symbolic language, 7 does not mean a large number. It means totality, completeness. Whatever darkness had gripped this woman, it had been total. She had been entirely consumed, and she came from a place that matched her condition. Magdala, Migdal in Hebrew, Taricheia in the Greek that Josephus used, sat on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was not the obscure fishing hamlet you might picture. The historian Josephus, who actually governed the region during the Jewish revolt 3 decades later, records that Magdala had a population of roughly 40,000, a fleet of 230 fishing boats, and its own hippodrome for chariot racing. It was a commercial powerhouse built on the salted fish trade that gave it its Greek name, Taricheia, the place of salted fish. The Talmud in the Book of Lamentations Rabbah remembers it for something else, its wealth and its moral corruption. And here is a detail most people walk right past. In 2009, archaeologists began excavating the ancient site of Magdala and uncovered a 1st-century synagogue, one of only a handful ever found from the time of Jesus. Inside, they found a carved stone block that stunned them. It bore the earliest known depiction of the 7-branch temple menorah ever carved in stone, alongside a rosette and a chariot of fire. Mary Magdalene almost certainly sat in this synagogue. She almost certainly looked at that carved menorah. She knew the temple and its symbols before the darkness took her, and she knew them again after Jesus drove the darkness out. The woman walking through the cold streets of Jerusalem that morning was not fragile. She was a woman of means. Luke 8:3 says plainly that she supported Jesus' ministry out of her own resources. And she was a woman of ferocious loyalty. 7 demons had not destroyed her. 3 days of grief would not stop her. She was not alone. Mark's Gospel tells us other women accompanied her: Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. They had purchased aromatic spices the previous evening. The moment 3 stars appeared in the sky, signaling the Sabbath's end. The spices included myrrh and aloes, and their purpose was intimate and terrible. They intended to finish preparing the body of Jesus for permanent burial. What most people miss is that the body had already received an extraordinary provision of spices. On Friday evening, before the Sabbath descended, a Pharisee named Nicodemus, the same man who had once come to Jesus by night, afraid to be seen, arrived at the tomb, carrying approximately 75 Roman pounds of a myrrh and aloes mixture. That is roughly 33 kilograms. To put this in perspective, a Roman pound of myrrh cost between 3 and 5 denarii on the open market, harvested from commiphora trees in southern Arabia and transported along Nabatean caravan routes at enormous expense. Nicodemus's provision would have cost somewhere between 225 and 375 denarii, close to a full year's wages for an ordinary laborer. This was not a burial preparation. This was a royal anointing. This was a man who finally understood, too late and just in time, who he had been speaking with in the dark that night years before, and who emptied his wealth to honor what he now could not deny. But it had been done in haste. The Friday evening preparation was a race against the Sabbath, and the women knew the body deserved more. So they came with additional spices, walking through streets that would not begin to fill for another 2 hours, past the Geneth Gate, the garden gate that Josephus mentions in the second wall near the execution grounds, and out toward the tomb cut into the limestone hillside north of the city. And as they walked, they asked each other the only practical question that mattered. Mark 16:3 preserves it, and the honesty of it is devastating. Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? They knew the stone. They had watched Joseph of Arimathea's servants roll it into place on Friday evening. It was a golel, a massive disk of limestone, estimated between 1.2 and 1.5 meters in diameter, 1/4 meter thick, weighing between 1 and 2 tons. Archaeological surveys of 1st century Jerusalem have uncovered over 900 rock-cut tombs from this period, but only 4 of them had round rolling stones. Every single one belonged to a wealthy or prominent family. The typical burial tomb had a square blocking stone that was simply muscled into place. A rolling stone was expensive to engineer. It required a precisely cut channel carved into the bedrock at a deliberate slope, so that gravity would hold the stone shut once it was rolled into position, which meant that opening it required rolling that massive disc uphill against the grade. A minimum of 3 or 4 strong men. The women had none. They knew this. They discussed it openly. And they kept walking. I want you to stay with that for a moment, because it tells you something about what grief joined to love can do. These women had no plan for the stone. They had no solution to the most basic logistical problem standing between them and the body they had come to anoint. And they did not turn back. They did not send someone ahead to recruit help. They walked forward into an impossible situation because not going was more unbearable than going without a solution. That is not sentimentality. That is the kind of devotion that moves the arm of God. Now, while the women walked, something else was happening at the tomb. And this is where the story becomes something no first-century forger would have dared to invent. A Roman guard detail was stationed at the entrance. Matthew's Gospel is precise about this. The chief priests and Pharisees had gone to Pontius Pilate on the Sabbath itself, and notice the irony so sharp it draws blood. The same religious leaders who had condemned Jesus for violating the Sabbath now violated it themselves, traveling to the Roman governor's residence and conducting official business on the day of rest, because their fear of what this dead man might still do overwhelmed their own law. They asked for a guard. Pilate gave them one. The Greek word Matthew uses is custodia, a direct transliteration of the Latin custodia, a formal Roman security detail. These were not temple police. These were not hired watchmen. These were Roman soldiers, 4 to 16 of them operating in rotating watches, and they served under a military code that made failure a death sentence. The Digest of Justinian, the comprehensive compilation of Roman military law, specifies the punishment for a guard who fell asleep or abandoned his post, fustuarium. His fellow soldiers would beat him to death with clubs and stones. There was no trial. There was no appeal. These men did not sleep, and Pilate had authorized one additional measure. The tomb was sealed, not just with the stone, but with a signaculum, an official Roman seal. A cord was stretched across the face of the stone and anchored at both ends with clay or wax, stamped with the imperial signet. Breaking that seal was not a religious offense. It was a crime against Rome. It was punishable by death. So picture the scene in the final minutes before dawn. A 2-ton stone, a sloped channel holding it shut by gravity, a cord bearing the seal of the Roman Empire, and 4 to 16 of the most disciplined soldiers the ancient world had ever produced, men trained, as Vegetius records in his military manual, to march nearly 30 kilometers in 5 hours, carrying over 20 kilograms of equipment, to fight with swords against wooden posts until their arms burned, to swim rivers in full armor. These men stood between the world and the body inside that tomb, and the religious authorities believed that was enough. It was not. Matthew 28:2 records what happened next with 2 Greek words that shake the ground beneath the text itself: seismos, megas. A great shaking, the same phrase Matthew used for the supernatural storm on the Sea of Galilee, the same phrase he used for the earthquake that split rocks when Jesus died on the cross. This was not a gentle tremor. Geologists studying Dead Sea sediment cores, a team led by Jefferson Williams, published in the International Geology Review in 2012, have found physical evidence of a significant seismic event in the region around 31 AD, consistent with the time frame of the Gospel accounts. The earth itself responded to what was happening inside that tomb, and then an angel descended. Matthew describes 2 specific visual details, and both are extraordinary. His face was like lightning. The Greek word is astrap, which does not mean a glow or a shimmer. It means the visible white flash of a lightning bolt, the kind of radiance that forces your eyes shut before your brain can process what it has seen. And his garments were white as snow, lukon hos chion, not ceremonial white, not linen white, but the absolute white of fresh snow under direct sunlight, the kind of white that contains no shadow. The Roman soldiers, the men who had been trained to face cavalry charges without breaking formation, to hold siege lines under a rain of stones and burning pitch, these men became, in Matthew's precise Greek, hos nekroi, like dead men. They collapsed, not from a blow, not from a wound, from terror so overwhelming that their bodies simply stopped functioning. No ancient author inventing a story about Roman soldiers would write this detail. It would invite instant ridicule. You do not make the most feared military force in the known world faint unless it actually happened and the witnesses could not deny it. The angel rolled back the stone, and here is the detail that matters. He did not roll it back to let Jesus out. He rolled it back to let the women in. The resurrection had already occurred. The tomb was already empty. The stone was not the barrier to Christ's departure. The risen body of the Son of God was not stopped by limestone. The stone was the barrier to human witness. It was moved so that people could see, so that Mary could see. When the women arrived, the ground had already shifted. Mark's Gospel says they found the stone rolled away and entered the tomb. And here the details between the gospel accounts create not contradiction, but the layered texture of multiple eyewitnesses describing the same overwhelming event from different vantage points. Mark says they saw a young man, a neaniskon, seated on the right side, dressed in a white stole, a long, flowing robe. And here is something scholars have noticed that sends a chill through you if you read Mark carefully. The word neaniskon appears only one other time in Mark's entire Gospel, in chapter 14, verses 51 and 52, where a young man following Jesus at his arrest in Gethsemane is seized by the guards and flees naked, leaving his linen garment behind. A young man who lost his garment at the moment of Jesus' capture. A young man clothed in radiant white at the moment of Jesus' victory. Mark is not being careless. Mark is being a poet. The garment stripped in the Garden of Despair is answered by the garment restored in the Garden of Resurrection. The angel spoke. "Do not be afraid," he said, and if there is a phrase that echoes through the entire biblical story like a heartbeat, it is this one, spoken at every moment when heaven intersects earth and human beings must decide whether to run or to stay. You are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Just as he said, 3 words that carry the weight of everything. Not a surprise to heaven. Not an unexpected development in the plan of God, the fulfillment of specific, public, repeated promises that the disciples had heard with their own ears and failed to understand until this morning. And the timing is where the fingerprint of God becomes unmistakable. Every single gospel account specifies that the resurrection occurred on the first day of the week. The Greek phrase is Mia ton Sabbaton, the day after Sabbath. But in the Jewish calendar, this particular first day of the week fell on something else, the Feast of First Fruits, prescribed in Leviticus 23, the day when the priest entered the temple and waved the first sheaf of the barley harvest before the Lord, declaring that the full harvest was coming. At the very hour when the priest in the temple was lifting that sheaf of grain toward heaven, Jesus of Nazareth was rising from the dead in a garden less than a kilometer away. And decades later, Paul would write the words that sealed the connection forever. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, the first sheaf, the promise that the full harvest of resurrection is coming. The timing was not coincidence, it was composition. God does not improvise, God composes. Now Mary Magdalene ran. John's Gospel gives us the most intimate account of what happened next, and if you have ever loved someone and lost them, these verses will undo you. She ran to Peter and to the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, and she said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have put him." She did not yet believe in resurrection. She believed in theft. Someone had taken the body, and her grief, already unbearable, now had no place to go, because even the tomb, even the cold comfort of sitting beside his wrapped body and weeping, had been taken from her. Peter and John ran to the tomb, and John, with the honesty of an old man remembering a morning that changed everything, records the small human detail that only an eyewitness would bother to mention. He outran Peter. The Greek text uses specific verbs. John prodrome tachyon, ran ahead faster. He was younger, or lighter, or simply more desperate. He arrived first, but he only bent down and peered inside. The Greek word is parakupsis, to stoop and look, because a first-century Jew did not casually enter a space that had contained a dead body. Peter, characteristically, had no such hesitation. He burst straight in. The Greek verb is eiselthen. He entered. That is Peter. That has always been Peter, the man who jumped out of boats, who swung swords in gardens, who spoke before he thought. He went in, and what he saw inside that tomb is the detail that should end every argument about what happened on this morning. John 20:6-7 provides what can only be described as forensic evidence. The linen burial wrappings, the orthonia, the expensive Egyptian linen that Joseph of Arimathea had provided, were lying flat, not scattered, not bunched, not torn, lying in place. And the sudarian, the face cloth, a square piece of fabric roughly 37 centimeters across, that had been wrapped around Jesus' head to bind the jaw shut after death, a practice the Mishnah confirms was standard Jewish burial procedure. This cloth was not lying with the other linens. It was in a separate place, and it was ligmenon, a perfect passive participle, meaning it had been deliberately rolled up, carefully wound or folded, and set apart. Think about what this means. If grave robbers had taken the body, they would have either taken the wrappings with it or torn them off in haste and scattered them across the chamber. No thief in history pauses mid-crime to fold the laundry. If the disciples had stolen the body, the very claim the chief priests would pay the soldiers to circulate, they would have been working in panicked darkness, racing against the possibility of the guards' return, and they certainly would not have taken the time to unwrap 75 pounds of burial spices, fold the face cloth, and arrange the linens neatly before fleeing into the night. What Peter saw in that tomb was not evidence of theft. It was evidence of someone who had simply risen, passed through the wrappings the way light passes through glass, and left behind an arrangement so deliberate, so calm, so unhurried that it spoke louder than any angel's announcement. The grave clothes were a message, and the message was, "I was not taken, I left." John records that he entered the tomb after Peter, saw the same evidence, and believed. One sentence. He saw and believed. But then John adds something painfully honest. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Belief came before understanding. The evidence preceded the theology. John did not believe because he had worked out the scriptural prophecies. He believed because the folded cloth and the empty wrappings left no other explanation. The understanding came later. The belief came now. And this is how it works for most of us, if we are honest. We do not arrive at faith through a completed theological system. We arrive because something we see or experience leaves no other door open. And then, slowly, the Scriptures illuminate what we already know is true. Peter and John left, but Mary stayed. She stood outside the tomb weeping, and when she finally bent to look inside, she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body had been, one at the head and one at the feet. They asked her a question of devastating simplicity. "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she answered with the raw honesty of unconsolable grief, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Then she turned around, and there was someone standing in the garden. Through her tears, in the grey half-light of early morning, she assumed he was the gardener, the Kepuros. John calls him in Greek, the man responsible for maintaining the garden around the tomb, who would naturally be the first person working the grounds at that hour. "Sir," she said, "if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him." The offer is physically impossible. A woman alone could not carry a man's body wrapped in 33 kilograms of spices, but grief does not calculate. Grief volunteers for the impossible, and then he spoke her name, one word. Mariam, not the Greek Maria, the Aramaic form, the sound she had heard in her mother's house, the sound that belonged to the most intimate rooms of her life. He said her name the way he had always said it, and the voice that had once commanded 7 demons to release her now called her by name in a garden at dawn. And everything she thought she knew about death and loss and the finality of a sealed tomb collapsed in a single syllable. She spun toward him. "Rabboni!" she cried. And this word deserves more attention than it usually receives. It is not the common rabbi. It is an Aramaic intensification found in the Talmud almost exclusively in prayers addressed to God. It means something like, "My great master," or "my dear teacher," and its intimacy is startling. This is not the language of a student greeting a professor. This is the language of someone encountering the sacred and finding that the sacred knows their name. She grasped him. The Greek makes this clear. Jesus' words in verse 17 use the present imperative with a negative particle, me mu haptu, which means not "do not touch me," but "stop clinging to me." She had already taken hold of him. She was holding on as if the universe might try to take him from her again, and she intended to make that impossible. And Jesus gently said, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." There is a depth in that phrase that has occupied theologians for 2,000 years. Jesus was in transit. He was between resurrection and ascension, between the tomb and the right hand of the Father, and some scholars have recognized an extraordinary parallel. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest passed from the sacrifice to the Holy of Holies, carrying the blood, and during that transit he was not to be touched by anyone. He was consecrated, set apart, moving between the offering and the presentation. And here was Jesus, the Lamb and the priest in one person, moving between the cross and the throne, carrying not the blood of bulls and goats, but his own blood. And for a brief window of sacred time, even the woman who loved him most could not hold him. Not because he did not want to be held, because the work was not yet complete. The first Adam was placed in a garden. He was given everything, and he lost it through disobedience, and a woman grieved beside him as paradise collapsed. Now the last Adam, Paul's phrase from 1 Corinthians 15:45, stood in a garden. He had taken back everything through obedience unto death, and a woman wept beside him as paradise was restored. The gardener. Mary was not wrong. She was more right than she knew. Tell me in the comments, has there been a moment in your own life when Jesus spoke your name in a darkness you thought would never end? When you were certain he was gone, and then his voice broke through. Meanwhile, across the city, the Roman guards were delivering their report to the chief priests. And what happened next is one of the most revealing episodes in the entire resurrection narrative. Matthew 28:11-15 records that the soldiers told the priests everything, and the priests' response was not investigation. It was not a counter-expedition to the tomb. It was a bribe. They gave the soldiers a large sum of money and told them to say, "His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep." The cover story is self-destroying. If the soldiers were asleep, they could not know who took the body. If they were awake, they would have stopped it or died trying, because the alternative was fustuarium. The story requires the listener to believe that a group of terrified fishermen and tax collectors who had fled at the mere sight of an armed arresting party in Gethsemane somehow overpowered or evaded a Roman military detail, broke an imperial seal, a capital offense, rolled a 2-ton stone uphill, unwrapped a body coated in 33 kilograms of burial spices, carefully folded the facecloth and laid the linens flat, carried the body away without leaving a trace, and then spent the rest of their lives being tortured and executed for proclaiming the resurrection of a man they knew was still dead. Every link in that chain snaps under the slightest pressure. And yet the story was still being circulated over a century later. Justin Martyr, writing around 155 AD, records in his dialogue with Trypho that the Jewish community in his day was still telling this version, which means for over 100 years, the best counter-argument to the resurrection was a story that contradicted itself in its opening sentence. The tomb is still there, or rather, the place where the tomb was is still there, transformed beyond recognition by 17 centuries of veneration and construction and destruction and reconstruction. Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Old City of Jerusalem, a small structure called the Edicule encloses what tradition has identified as the burial site since the 4th century. Emperor Constantine, after his conversion, ordered the Roman temple to Venus that had been built over the site demolished in 325 AD, and his engineers performed something remarkable. They cut away the entire hillside around the tomb, isolating the burial chamber as a freestanding monument. In 2016, a team from the National Technical University of Athens, working with the National Geographic Society, opened the marble cladding that had covered the burial shelf for centuries. Beneath the layers of marble and rubble and devotion, they found it, the original limestone bed, the rock surface where the body had been laid, still there, still waiting to be seen, still testifying. There is another site, north of the Damascus Gate, discovered in 1867. A rock-cut tomb sits in a garden beside a cliff face that looks from certain angles unmistakably like a skull. Golgotha, the place of the skull. The garden tomb, as it is known, has a groove cut for a rolling stone, a weeping chamber, and the quiet green beauty of a place that feels like resurrection, even if most archaeologists date its construction to the 8th or 7th century BC, centuries too early for the new tomb Matthew describes. But visitors who stand in that garden and look at that empty chamber understand something that no archaeological debate can resolve. What it would have felt like to be Mary, standing in a garden at dawn, turning around to find that death had been overruled. A stone that gravity held shut was moved by a hand that made gravity. A seal that bore the authority of Rome was broken by the authority that lent Rome its temporary power. Soldiers trained to fear nothing met something that reduced them to nothing. And a woman who came carrying spices for a corpse went home carrying a message for the world. That message has not been amended, it has not been revised, it has not been softened by the passing of 2,000 years. It's the same message Mary carried back to the disciples on that first morning, breathless, tear-streaked, radiant with an impossible joy. I have seen the Lord, and he knows my name. If this morning has become real to you, if you can feel the cold stone under Mary's feet and the warmth of that single spoken word in a garden, then I invite you to walk with us further into these stories. There is so much more to see. Subscribe to this channel, because what we will uncover together in the weeks ahead will change how you read every page of the Bible you thought you already knew. The tomb is empty, the stone is rolled away, and the voice that called Mary by name in the grey light of dawn is still speaking, still calling, still saying the one word that matters most. Yours, your name, spoken by the risen Christ, in the garden of your own morning right now.